Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Near Memo. Today with me, Greg, flying solo, and I've got a special guest here, Matthew Berk, who is the CEO and co-founder of a specialty coffee company, BeanBox. And I've known Matthew for many years, off and on. I mean, we're just having contact now after a whole bunch of time of not talking to each other. And this interview sort of arose serendipitously out of another conversation. But I think it's a really interesting business. And your history is interesting because you were a software guy, startup guy in the Silicon Valley, Seattle sense. And now you're running a real business IRL with a supply chain and a physical product. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and BeanBox and what that's all about?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I have a little bit of an odd duck of a background. I went to school for humanities, but I have also been writing code, not software, but code, at least since the late 1970s. And when I got out of graduate school working on a PhD in English, I got out because I wanted to write code for the rest of my life. And
that's a kind of a grim statement.
I don't see it that way. I think writing code is like incredibly joyful, and it comes with all kinds of challenges, and the challenges are new every day. And I'm over a quarter of a century into writing code professionally and working in tech, and I still have challenges all the time that are head scratchers or really difficult or thought provoking, and that's kind of why I went in that direction. But that's kind of my background is again coming from left field to tech.
We can circle back to the impact of ChatGPT and AI on the future of coding at some later point in the conversation. Well, I never talk about my background, but I was a lawyer for almost a decade. And I did a sort of philosophy and psychology undergraduate degree. And I thought going to law school would be like an extension of sort of the, thinking about how the good society was organized and that kind of thing. And it's really trade school. And I kind of hated it. And I hated the idea that my life was devoted to fighting with people over money. I did civil litigation. And so, it took me 10 years practically to sort of extricate myself. But this is not about me. This is about you. So give us a little bit of a taste of what your startup experience was. I encountered you for the first time, I think, when you were at OpenList, which was an interesting local search startup that was kind of ahead of its time, or really ahead of its time in certain respects. So refresh. Nobody's going to remember OpenList except some real old timers, but refresh our memory about what that was and why it was interesting, and then any other sort of interesting anecdotes that you want to throw in.
Yeah, so actually what I'd say is, for me, the bridge from kind of literature and humanities back into code was that for most of my career, I ended up focusing in some way, shape, or form on content and text. And OpenList was started in 2002. It was, to my knowledge, the very first local search engine. We went and crawled the web, and we pulled down content about eventually all types of local businesses. And the idea was to allow people to use natural language and kind of deep metadata in order to find the perfect fill in the blank. It might be like a restaurant that's good for kids, that's in a particular neighborhood, that's open late, that isn't too overpriced, and you love soba. And so we built a local search engine. And again, it was kind of like we aggregated all this content. We applied search technology to it. And back then, search technology wasn't pull some open source off the shelf. We wrote everything by hand. So I think 2002, 2003, we literally developed like a parser for looking at the queries and, inverted indexes. And we had to do Levenshtein distances on terms and develop a vocabulary and a taxonomy. And all of that was it was unusual. It was more academic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were way, way ahead of your time in certain respects. Like what you were describing about this sort of attributes and additional sort of niche and kind of nuance parameters. Some people would call that semantic search, or the methodology used to get at that. And you were years ahead of the discussion, really, except maybe in some obscure academic circles.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, Google was brand new, and people were used to a different kind of search and a different kind of search engine. Primarily, if you wanted to find content online, you'd go to directories, and so the world was full of directories and not a lot of search. And Google, there were still people in 2002 who were like, "What's the Google?" And that seems like a very odd world to inhabit, but that's kind of what it was. And as you know, Greg, like part of what we did there is we did an early version of content generation. We used generative grammars to create summaries based upon what people said about a restaurant or a hotel. We would comb through these hundreds or thousands of reviews about a particular place, and then we would summarize them the way they used to in kind of a Zagat guide. And we'd use that to create a summary so that you didn't have to crawl through hundreds again or thousands of reviews. And as you know, it's come full circle. Amazon
Yeah.
is experimenting with summarizing reviews and paraphrasing them, and we were
Right.
doing that about 20 years
And
ago.
which is kind of amazing, in to think about in retrospect. I mean, I appreciated it at the time, but now, kind of given everything that's happened, it's really sort of amazing that you guys were doing that. And but the market was, timing is an important thing, and the market wasn't appropriately conditioned for what you were doing. So what happened to OpenList? It got bought by Marchex, is that right? Or
Yeah,
somebody bought it?
so OpenList was purchased by Marchex. Marchex
Yeah.
is effectively, it was an ad tech roll up. They've since
Was it call
pivoted.
was call measurement, call tracking platform at the time?
Yeah, they've pivoted to kind of call and voice oriented measurement and analytics. But at the time, it was a roll up of a number of companies that were doing all some form of ad tech. And one of the things they owned was a portfolio of, it was like 100,000 plus domain
Directories.
names.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And those domain names were highly specific to localities and verticals. So, you know,
Right. It was a big.
restaurant98102 or seattlehotels.com.
Right.
And
When those
so
things could exist.
Yes, that's right. And so what they had was kind of a footprint that represented things in the real world. And they're like, yeah, we don't have any content for this. And we thought, we have a lot, not only do we have a lot of content, but we have a lot of search, and you can slice that infinitely thin. So you could have a Nob Hill restaurants just by taking one little slice of all the data we had, surfacing that up as search and content. And within a month or two of the acquisition, we were serving up content and search on something like 100,000 different websites with traffic in the tens of millions on a monthly basis. And it was basically using search as content across a large
And
portfolio, which was also pretty novel at the time.
they plugged in ads on those domains. Is that right? Yeah,
Yeah,
and it
that's
was a
right.
kind. And you could charge a premium for those because the user intent was more specific, and so there was a kind of arbitrage game that a lot of people. I'm not saying it was a game, but there was a kind of arbitrage um, approach to SEO that a lot of people did, and was quite successful for a number of years, uh, until it wasn't, till Google
Yeah,
sort of
if
cracked
you can
down on it.
capture if you can capture intent and serve it up highly relevant content, especially where those queries are primarily commercial in nature. So, like zip code plus plumber.
Right.
That's highly relevant. It's surfaced in search. You find your way to that domain. And if you found useful content and even useful ads, that was the whole kind of hypothesis is give people the most relevant stuff, whether it's organic, whether it's search, or whether it's ads, and the intent quotient will be super high, and you can charge a premium there. And it worked incredibly well for quite a while.
Well, you could argue that somebody like TripAdvisor or any of the directories that are vertical do a version of that today.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly right.
so sort of fast forward 20 years, and what tell us the story behind BeanBox. What was the inspiration for that? And where were you at the time when you came up with that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of a really great failure pivot story. My co-founder and I were working on it was a classic tech startup. We built some data mining tools, we built some mobile apps, and the whole hypothesis was um, reviews are not enough to help people make good decisions about what they do in the real world. So we're going to come up with a platform for person to person recommendations. So I might trust you for picking a restaurant in San Francisco, but I don't know if I'd trust you to pick a ski resort to take my family on vacation. And so we kind of built this entire platform to allow people to identify those they trusted and exchange with them personal recommendations. And it was sort of highly targeted. It was very interesting, also very kind of before its time. And we got to a place where people were super engaged the first time, but not the nth time. Which, when you're developing anything for a consumer, if you don't have stick, you don't grow. And so we realized that we needed to pivot, and we looked through the data. As good analytic folk do, we looked through the data and we said, all right, well, we have all this initial usage data. Like, what's interesting to people? And the obvious stuff kind of tumbled out, like, oh, well, people are interested in what gadgets to buy and where to go on vacation and where to eat. And those were all super crowded verticals. And then something really odd happened, which is people were interested in coffee. And like, neither of us were very into coffee. And we're like, people are swapping recommendations for sources for coffees, for cafes, for coffee equipment. And we thought, well, what's going on here? And at the same time, we were located in a funky little neighborhood. And when we interviewed people about their sort of habits around recommendations, we took them for coffee, right? And any good product manager will take someone out for coffee and pick their brain about what they do or how they do it. And we found ourselves in these cafes that were not like the Starbucks we were in downtown. And the coffee tasted really great. And so after a couple of weeks of thinking through how we might pivot, we decided like we wanted to be in a business that generated cash. That was very clear. No more speculative software development. We wanted to be in a business that provided joy to customers. I'm not sure the world needs a bunch more ad servers or more ad tech or even search tech. And we thought there was something in coffee, and so we came up with this notion that like people wanted better coffee. They were expressing that by going to specialty cafes. And we thought, well, what happens when a new type of product has demand or appetite that grows in the world? The next thing that usually happens is that it grows for the home. And so we thought like this appetite for great high-end coffee is going to move out of cafes, or people don't have access to cafes. It's going to move to the home. So part
Or
of
they
it
don't want to
was
spend $6 a cup of coffee.
for a cup, right? And so, like the pandemic was a really great example of proving out that hypothesis. And it's, stayed much the same even post-pandemic. And, like what was natural to us was I've been doing e-commerce for since the late 90s. And so we thought, oh, there's an e-commerce component and there's a software component and there's a marketing component and it's all digital. But what we never expected, and this is like the beauty of the pivot, is that we had to learn how to work with coffee. And coffee is this very physical, very real, very concrete product. And so we very quickly became a manufacturer of coffee products. And so we found ourselves in an end to end business it started with sourcing and supply chain of coffee through to receiving, manufacturing unique products, inventory, fulfillment, and then all the digital stuff. And so it became this sort of end to end model for e commerce. And, we've been doing it for almost a decade since then. And as I mentioned before, every day there's an opportunity to write code to make the business better. But there's also this aspect of we're producing a real product that people consume. They put it in their bodies and they trust you. They trust you for the products and for your selection of coffee. And it was a very hard pivot. And our investors cared more about kind of the investment in the team than the particular idea. So they were very supportive. And that's kind of where I've been dwelling since then. And it's just a totally different business than a fully digital world where you're just moving electrons. And here we're moving both electrons and atoms. We generate cash and we make people happy when they consume our product. And I think that's a pretty special business to be in.
Do you sell obviously over the internet, and it's a subscription business, as I understand it? Do you have distribution in physical stores as well, or cafes?
Yeah, so we have a couple of customers who feature our products on shelves. We've sold a lot through Walmart. We're partners with Uncommon Goods. They have a really unique curated selection of gifts from us. And that is also a whole kind of world unto itself that we were not necessarily prepared for. That also is very physical. The requirements for packaging and transport and marking and secondary
Logistics.
packaging,
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
logistics. And the products have very specific requirements to be featured on a shelf. Everything from how many in a case to which direction they face in a case to being scannable to being palletizable. And that was kind of an expansion that was super interesting as well. But primarily, we're in love with a direct to consumer model where we know our customers, we talk to our customers, and when we get something wrong with a coffee or a new product, we know right away. And that type of customer feedback is it's pretty unusual. If you're putting products on shelves, your primary customer is the retailer, and if you're putting products in people's kitchens and in their bodies, your primary customer is the consumer of the product. And you hear everything that goes right, which is great, and anything that goes wrong, which is an opportunity to improve.
So I would imagine the learning curve on all those different. I mean, sounds like you had to sort of simultaneously learn and master a lot of different disciplines in retail and commerce and warehousing and logistics. What was the most challenging thing coming from your background into this physical supply chain world that you
Yeah,
had to learn?
yeah. I mean, this is like really interesting. I love thinking about this. Like when a startup shows up or a new piece of software shows up, the first thing engineers and other folks in tech as well, the first thing they ask is, but will it scale? And there's sort of a weird flattening of what that means in the world, especially among engineers. It's like either it scales or it doesn't. The truth is that when you grow a business, your scale shifts over time. And in a seasonal business, your scale shifts dramatically at a peak and then recedes as you go away from peak. And so you have this kind of seasonal flux in what is required to scale. Now, it's one thing to talk about how to scale software and systems, but it's quite another thing to talk about how to scale physical process. So, as an example, like last year, we handled 365,000 pounds of specialty coffee, and that is a pretty interesting scale in the world of coffee. On the one hand, it's tiny compared to like the big commodity guys, but compared to how most specialty coffee is kind of handled and managed and sold, it's pretty darn big. And the fascinating thing is like as your business grows and as you go in and out of peak cycles, you become a chaser of bottleneck. And this is true in software, and it's true when you're working with a physical product. As the volume shifts, what was previously a bottleneck here that you may fix becomes a bottleneck over here. And so you spend your time scaling, not kind of preparing for the ultimate scale, but realizing where your bottleneck has now moved. So a really, really simple example is when we started, we had coffee that we would scoop up, uh, put into a bag, and weigh the bag, and that's pretty inefficient. And over time, we developed our own mechanical solution for that, and then we bought commercial scales. And then we had to scale beyond that. And then eventually we got to high speed bag packaging lines. And then we customized that. And then now we have multiple ones. And we're now at a place where we've gone in under a decade from filling bags by hand over a cheap scale to having 4 packaging lines that can fill a total of 180 bags per minute. And every time you have a disjoint in scale, you realize that you solve one problem and the bottleneck moves either before or after the problem. And what's fascinating is that there are 2 things. One is that scale is not a binary, and it does not look like that. And it's just like software, where you might improve the speed or performance or throughput of one component, only to realize that a feeding component or receiving component is now not up to the task of the same throughput. And so we've chased that around as if, we're writing software. It just happens to work with beans and bags and boxes.
So you're talking about, a number of metrics here. Why don't you just give us an overview of how big the business is in terms of revenue and anything else that'll give us a sense of what you're doing. I mean, you mentioned your overall 360 plus pounds, 1,000 pounds of coffee, but what kind of volume are you doing, and what is that revenue?
Yeah, so like a couple of numbers to kind of benchmark where we are. Last year we did 11 million in revenue. About 50% of our normal revenue that is outside of holiday now comes from subscriber revenue, that is people who are on recurring subscriptions. Last year, we handled and turned into product 365,000 pounds of specialty coffee. Last year, for one partner alone, we manufactured about 250,000 coffee gifts for them. We're a tiny business in the sense that we have 14 full-time employees. And so that means a lot of hats, but it also means a lot of automation. And we've learned over 9 years, the more automation you have, the fewer hands you need to manage your coffee and your product and your manufacturing, your fulfillment. Other things about the business, like last year we grew 26% year over year in terms of our subscriber revenue. So it's one of the areas of the business that's growing really strong. Other things, we're tiny in terms of like large coffee manufacturers. We have a facility, it's about 24,000 square feet. And we have, over the course of, again, like close to a decade, we've had hundreds of thousands of customers. And the amazing thing is some of the customers we had in month 1 of 2014
And they're still
are
with you.
are still customers today, and they call us up and we know their names. And so as we've scaled, I think because of the way we started it, where every time we made a sale, we would write a personal note of thanks, and where we answered the phone when someone had a question. 9 years later, we know who our longest term subscribers are, even though the business is in a radically different place. So that's just kind of a sense of how big we are. We have 50 suppliers, coffee roasters we source from all over the United States and all over the world. We now have a coffee roasting partner in Europe, which is new to us. And, we keep expanding over time, both the products as well as how we source them and where we source them from and number of customers. And that whole journey means scaling in different ways as you grow up.
So what has been the biggest sort of happy surprise from all this? I mean, you talk about the challenges, but what have you discovered about running a real business? Not that software isn't a real business, but a real world business with a product that has pleased you, impressed you, in ways that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, so for me, like so I think I'm a builder. A lot of the people you talk to are probably builders. They like to create stuff. They like to see it out in the world. And so I think there's a particular delight in building something that's not just a bunch of software. but is also something very physical. And part of that is making new products. Every year we have new products. Um, I think for me, like the best part of all of it, and I didn't expect this, is um, people are really happy when they get our product, and it shows, and they communicate it, and we see that on social, and we see that when they contact us, and there's something like very unique about being in a position where you can create a real consumer brand. Now, granted, we're not throwing like tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at it the way some venture fueled companies do, but we're an established brand. People trust us. It has a real product. And there's a level of joy when people get our product. It makes them really happy. They're continually trying new coffees. They have changed their coffee habits from maybe buying pre-ground in the supermarket and stuffing it in the freezer, or stopping at Starbucks every day. And now they're kind of a BeanBox only coffee drinker. And it makes people happy. And by extension, when we do the work, even when it's like really challenging, even when times are difficult, we know that people are happy. And I think having that in software is, it's
It's
really,
it's it's
it's
it's much
hard.
less it's much less immediate. I mean, there is user feedback, and there are people who will write testimonials and give good reviews and say this is a great product and really makes me more efficient. But it's not the same as what you're describing, where you have that sort of very tangible, you made my day better. I really appreciate what you're doing for me. Um, as I said to you before, you're talking about people moving from kind of a maybe a more pedestrian approach, let's just say, without being too pejorative about it, to a more uh, sophisticated coffee snob oriented um, approach. I've gone the opposite way. I used to be much more of a coffee fetishist and really into it, and only the unground beans and in the all of that. And now I drink the hotel coffee. It's
Yeah.
like
Well, to be fair, I do too. There's something pleasant in every cup that I drink. It doesn't matter. I can get it at a gas station and be like, oh, this is interesting.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't agree with that statement. It's a kind of a necessity. It's not quite an addiction problem, but it's sort of a necessary element at times. So
But
once I
here,
cross that,
no,
go
but
ahead.
so here's the thing. This is another thing that I found surprising. Like, one of the reasons we started this business is like we thought there was going to be something there. And sure enough, like now people talk about what we're doing. It's like direct to consumer coffee did not exist when we started. Subscription coffee more or less did not exist when we started. And now it's like a part of the market. But for us, like, it's access to coffee and education. And we felt, I'll just be really like brutally honest, like we would walk into one of these little cafes, and we just didn't feel hip. We didn't know what to ask for. We felt like someone was going to laugh at us if we asked for the wrong thing. It's like, can I have a Guatemala pour over? Like, is that different than an Ethiopian? I don't know. And so there's like a psychological barrier in coffee. And so I think what's very interesting for us is our customers are not coffee snobs. They really appreciate it, but most of them, it's a question of access. Maybe they don't have one of these little cafes locally. Maybe they're like us, where we have tons of these cafes locally, and we feel intimidated to go in because maybe we'll ask for the wrong thing. So part of what we're doing is like making it so that you don't have to be a snob or an expert or a connoisseur, and you also don't have to walk into a cafe and worry that like you don't have the right tattoos, or you're going to ask for the wrong
Yeah,
type of coffee in the wrong way, right? So part of
I
it is just making it accessible.
I walked into a Pete's Coffee, one of the stores, at one point several years ago with a friend, and they were displaying some African coffee. I don't remember which country it came from, and they had this sort of description that was like wine, right? It was like notes of this and hints of that, and I just thought this is so pretentious. And it was the key flavor was blueberries in the
Mm.
coffee, and I thought this is bullshit. There's no way that this is going to taste like blueberries. So I bought some just because I was so provoked by it. And I took it home, and this was when I still was putting sugar in my coffee, which I no longer do. I took it home, I brewed a cup, I put a spoonful of sugar in it, and it did taste like blueberries.
Yes.
It was a real thing. And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, this is really interesting, because, there is a way in which coffee is sort of like wine, and you can develop a sensitivity to it, and there's a lot to know about it, and so on and so forth.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.